Everyone, and welcome to our lecture on selecting statistical tests. This is a commonly tested sort of question on the MBME exams. They'll give you a vignette and then they'll ask you to pick what would be the most appropriate statistical test in that scenario. And I'll say generally, there's really only three types of scenarios where they really make you pick what is the appropriate statistical test. So the first scenario is where you're asked to compare continuous measures, such as means, between two groups. This might involve comparing mean blood pressure between a group receiving placebo versus a group receiving intervention, or comparing mean blood glucose levels between someone with diabetes versus somebody without. But you're comparing mean values or continuous measures. And in this case, once you've kind of figured out that that's the scenario that you're in, all you have to ask yourself is how many groups are there? If you're comparing two groups, then you're dealing with a t-test. Whereas if you're comparing three or more groups, then it's an ANOVA analysis. So that's scenario one. Scenario two is where you're asked to compare categorical measures or count data between groups. So for example, say you wanted to determine the potential association between eye color and risk for non-melanoma skin cancer. You could break up the groups into those with blue eyes, those with brown eyes, those with black eyes, and then ask, how many had non-melanoma skin cancer and how many did not. So we can see in that situation, it's count data. We can count the number of people in each of those groups who have the outcome or don't have the outcome. So it is not a continuous measure like a mean, it is count data. And because it is count data, we know we're kind of in the second scenario. And in that situation, rather than asking, how many groups are we comparing, you really want to ask, what is the sample size? In most cases on the test, it'll be a medium to large sample size, in which case the default answer is the chi-squared exam. Every once in a while, if it is a small sample size study, which formally is defined as greater than 20% of the cells within the 2x2 or 3x3 or X by X table have a cell size less than 5, then technically you would do a Fisher's exact test. I think this is a little bit above and beyond what's expected on the exam, but I think the main concept to take is that Fisher's exact test and the chi-square test are pretty much analogous to one another. The third scenario is where you're not actually comparing values between groups, but more so just assessing a relationship between two variables. So you're not comparing, one group with the intervention versus one group without the intervention, or one group with a risk factor versus another group without the risk factor. You're just saying, I have these two variables and how are they related to one another? And there's really two ways that we can go about measuring that relationship. The first, which is commonly used in research, but honestly doesn't come up that much on the exam, is doing some form of regression analysis. So in these sort of analyses, we're asking ourselves, how can we model the effect of a variable X, our independent variable, on our variable Y, our dependent variable? And in this situation, the way you determine what type of regression to perform is based on the outcome. If it is a continuous outcome, like again, a mean, then you would do linear regression. Whereas if it is a binary outcome, like yes, no, they had cancer, they didn't have cancer, they had heart disease or they didn't have heart disease, then it would be logistic regression. Again, this is commonly used in research, but doesn't show up so much on the exam. The thing that does show up a lot on the exam is correlation. And this is a way of just looking at how are X and Y related? Not so much like is X causing Y, but how are the two variables related? And one really key idea that I want you to take away is that the result of a correlation analysis is this correlation coefficient R. And you want to remember that this represents a vector, and that vectors by definition represent both strength of the relationship and direction of the relationship. And therefore the correlation coefficient R can take values ranging from -1 to 1. And often they like to test this by using graphs. So if we do a graph here where we see X along the Y-axis, Y along the X-axis, we've basically shown the three major scenarios they like to test. So if we have this red line, which is going from the bottom left to the upper right, we see that as X goes up, Y is also going up. That is a positive, strong correlation. And therefore, this is represented by an R equals 1. If we look at the purple line, where just a flat line, we see that the value of Y is increasing as we move from left to right, but the value of X isn't changing at all. This tells us X and Y aren't really related with one another. There's no strength of relationship. And therefore, that is a situation where the correlation coefficient is 0. And then lastly, if we look at the green line, we see that as y increases as we move to the right, x decreases, we move down. This represents a strong negative relationship and therefore would be representative of an R of -1. So again, always keep in mind that the correlation coefficient represents both the strength of the relationship and the direction of the relationship. The last thing, which is just a key definition to remember, in case they ask you this on the exam, it's kind of the thing you either know it or you don't. So I figured I'd, bring it up. If you are to square the correlation coefficient R and get this R squared value, the interpretation of that R squared value is that it is the proportion of variance in one variable that is predicted by the other. So for example, if you have an R equals 1, then if you square that, you still get 1. So basically, the proportion of variance in variable X is 100% explained by the proportion of by variable Y. It's honestly just a definition to know, but I figured I'd bring it up. As with all the videos, I recommend that you do the associated practice problems to test your knowledge and whether you actually took away the main key points from this lecture. And as always, please like, comment, subscribe, and good luck.